the pilot, winging his way above the earth at 200 miles an hour, talks by radio telephone to ground stations or to other planes in the air. In thick weather, he is guided by radio beam and receives detailed reports of conditions ahead, gleaned through special instruments and new methods of meteorological calculation. He sits behind engines, the reliability of which, measured by yardsticks of the past, is all but unbelievable. I myself still fly a Wasp motor, which has carried me over the North Atlantic, part of the Pacific, to and from Mexico City, and many times across this continent.
Hello, you're listening to Crossword, where cultural clues lead to the truth, the word, and my name is Michelle McAloon. That recording that you just heard is the voice of Amelia Earhart. And this is the interview that I'm having today with an author named Rachel Hartigan, a National Geographic writer who's written a book called Lost about Amelia Earhart and her mysterious disappearance. It is a great interview. It's a fascinating subject, and I hope you enjoy it. Please, if you like this, please subscribe. Please tell a friend and find out more about me at bookclues.com. Happy listening. Fly safe. God bless. We have another great book to talk about today where we have a heroine, we have mystery, we have adventure, we have a little bit of conspiracy. And the book is Lost, Amelia Earhart's 3 Mysterious Deaths and 1 Extraordinary Life. And it is by Rachel Hartigan. Hi, Rachel. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm glad you're here. Rachel Hartigan is a former senior writer and editor with National Geographic, where she's focused on culture and history. Everybody loves National Geographic because it has a lot of great pictures in it. It is. It's a good magazine. It is fabulous. She has participated in 2 expeditions to the uninhabited island of Nikumaroro.
Yes, you did it.
Oh, I did it. Okay, there you go.
It's a hard one.
In search of the remains of Amelia Earhart. Previously, she served as editor of Book World at the Washington Post, and we are so sad that that is gone. Yeah. And as deputy editor for culture and education at U.S. News and World Report. She grew up in Reno, Nevada, and lives outside of Washington, D.C. When did Amelia Earhart's plane go lost?
July 2nd, 1937.
Right. So
almost 90 years. Yeah.
Almost 90 years. And, it's funny. People still talk about it. I wonder what the psychology is behind that collective memory of not being able to let it go. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I love how you have done this book because what you do is you show the 3 theories of what happened to Amelia. Was she kidnapped on Saipan? Was she, a castaway in a deserted island? Or did she drown in the Pacific? And you you take those 3 theories and you intertwine it with her life. All right, Rachel Hartigan, why Amelia Earhart?
Well, for me, it was just chance because I had a classic National Geographic experience. I was not one of the super adventurous people at National Geographic. I mean, I have friends and colleagues who hunted falcons with sheikhs in the Arabian Peninsula and did all sorts of exciting things. I mostly edited from my desk, but I did have this amazing encounter with an editor when I was going to the copy shop or the copy room. And he stopped me in the hall and he said, we have a berth on this ship that's going out to the island where some people think Amelia Earhart disappeared. Do you want to go on the expedition? And I said yes before I even realized, where we were actually going. I just knew that it was way out in the middle of the ocean and farther than I'd ever been. And I didn't at the time know a lot about Amelia Earhart beyond what everybody kind of knows. She was a flyer and a feminist and she disappeared. But as I started to learn more and more about her and saw what a complicated person she was and how interesting that time period was, especially the 20s and 30s, the more I got fascinated by her. And I was also fascinated by the people who are still looking for her. And so I wanted to delve deeper into why they were doing that.
She's a story, but the people that are still looking for her are also, I mean, the fact that people are still fascinated after so many years is definitely part of her story. Let's set Amelia up into a timeline. She was born in 1897, correct?
Correct.
In
Yeah.
Atchison, Kansas?
In Atchison, Kansas. Yeah. And she lived there. Her parents didn't actually live there, but her grandparents were prominent members of Atchison Society. Her grandfather, was part of the bank. He was a lawyer. They were the Earharts, and they lived on a bluff above the river. But her mother had married another lawyer who was not nearly as successful as her grandparents. So he finally got a good job with a railroad company, but had a hard time keeping it because he was an alcoholic. And they ended up bouncing around the Midwest for most of her life, certainly her teenage years. And she really glossed over that later on, saying, oh, yes, we were just Rolling Stones. But really, it was because they were sort of bouncing from nice house to less nice house to less nice house and really struggling for money. And I think that had very formative, that definitely shaped her.
Do you know what I find interesting? And this, I might be jumping ahead of the story, but the Fred Noonan, the man that she was going to navigate with, he had a reputation as a terrible drinker. And I kind of found that interesting because she had really a bad childhood experience because of alcoholism in the family. But then now she's depending on this guy, Fred Noonan, to be her navigator on this around the world trip. Did you find that interesting?
Yeah, I did find that interesting. And he's not the only one who's not the only alcoholic whose life how would I say that? She put her life in the hands of more than one alcoholic, because when she first flew across the ocean as a passenger, flew across the Atlantic, she basically had to roust the pilot out of bed after he'd had, what would you call, a bender. They'd been waiting for the weather to turn for, I can't remember, I think it was about 13 days, so they could take off in their pontoons from Trepassey in Nova Scotia. And they were getting sort of crazed by the fact they were stuck in this little town. And the pilot, Bill Schultz, was drinking a lot. And this is during the Prohibition, so it took a little bit of effort to find alcohol. And finally, the weather turned, sunny with the right amount of wind, and he was sleeping it off. And she just pulled him out of bed and said, we got to go. So that was super risky. But apparently, at least in her telling, he sobered up right away when they started flying, and then ended up flying. I can't remember how long that flight took, but it was an overnight flight. So at least 12 hours. She did that more than once. And to be honest, I don't understand why she would take such a terrible risk. I think probably in Fred Noonan's case, he was one of the best navigators around. He had been a navigator for Pan Am. He helped them map their flights across the Pacific. He'd already crossed the Pacific 18 times. So he had a lot of skills to outweigh the drinking. And some people said that, yes, he would go on these benders, but that was only when he had the time to do it, that he didn't do it when he was flying. There are some hints that he may have done that when they were in New Guinea, because that was where they took off for their last flight. And again, it was the waiting. They were waiting for the weather. They were waiting for his equipment to sync up. So I don't know, but still, yes, she really did put her life in the hands of these guys.
Interesting, very interesting. I didn't realize she kind of grew up. I want to say she was more upper crust growing up. This wasn't she wasn't a hanger rat. It looked like she was very fashionable and very classy, and didn't really grow up around aviation. How did she come into aviation?
She came in actually sort of very indirectly through finishing school, because yes, you're right. They were upper class. She was trained in all the right manners. They just didn't have money, but they had sort of a certain amount of social status. And when the family did come into a little bit of money, they sent Amelia and her sister to basically finishing schools. And one Christmas, this would be after the U.S. joined World War I, but several years after Canada had. Amelia went up to Toronto to visit her sister Muriel at school over Christmas, and she saw wounded soldiers. Toronto was very much a city at war. There were soldiers everywhere. And at one point, she and her sister saw, 4 soldiers without limbs walking down the street. And Amelia was so shocked by that because at that point, the U.S. was in the rah, rah, go us, bands are playing, we're making bandages, sort of the precursor to the terrible parts of war. But she saw the terrible parts of war in Toronto. And they also were training a lot of pilots there because that was the first war where aviation played a role. So she would go to demonstrations to see the pilots do their thing. And she tells this story, which may or not be exaggerated, but she and her friends were standing in a field near one of the airfields, and pilot was doing all sorts of loop-de-loops and tricks, and all the crowd was oohing and eyeing, and she and her friend were standing a little bit separate. And she said the pilot got a little bored and he decided that he was just going to fly at those 2 young ladies. And her friend took off running away, and Amelia just stood there and felt the little red plane go by her. And she
Oh my
said she
goodness.
felt it was whispering to her, but she didn't really have a chance. She couldn't learn then because everything was focused on the war. So they weren't going to take up any civilians to learn how to fly. And she didn't really get to learn until her family moved to Los Angeles in 1920. And then she went to another air demonstration and realized that this was her chance to learn. But she really wanted to learn from female instructor because she was afraid that a male instructor would be too patronizing and not take her seriously.
She kind of learns hook by crook. And I know there probably wasn't a flight program. And actually, at the end, when some of her navigational issues, when she got lost on that last flight, were probably, and as I was reading, probably training issues. Like, how could she not know Morse code? How could she not know the directional finder? She wasn't even operating her, and her directional finder was a very basic rudimentary navigational, and maybe, I don't know, maybe it was new at that time, but she did not know how to operate it. So you can see where she had holes in her aviation training. That may have been true for everybody. It may have been true for men too, because who knows what kind of FAA training program was in place there, but it was probably challenging for her as a woman to get the same degree of training.
Yeah, I think part of the issue was that the male pilots had gone through the war and had been trained by the military. So, but the women didn't have that opportunity. She was entering the field as it was new, but then the war kind of made it more regulation in a way because the military, of course, had skills that they wanted their pilots to know. Like you said, she was a bit more hook and crook, hook by crook.
Hook by crook, right?
Well, however you say that.
A wing and a prayer. Let's put it that way.
There we go. That's a better one.
There you go. So she quickly kind of gained celebrity status, though, because she enters in races. She's good looking, right? She's fairly young. She's very vibrant. Apparently she's well spoken. She's on speaking tours and things like that. She flies the Atlantic, 1932, I think it was.
Yeah.
It flies the Atlantic, becomes the first woman to cross the Atlantic, correct?
Right. And only the first woman to cross, yeah.
Okay.
As a passenger. And that was in 1928. And then 1932, she became the first woman to fly solo and only the second person to fly solo after Lindbergh across the Atlantic.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Huh. That's interesting. And there's a character that she marries, George Putnam. And you know what? I've read about George Putnam through the years, and sometimes he's cast as kind of a overbearing publicity hound. In your book, you really don't characterize him that. And George Putnam is her husband. How did you see George Putnam?
Well, I think he was fairly overbearing. He had a nose for publicity for sure. And he got Lindbergh to supposedly write his best-selling book within a month of making the flight. He was a wheeler and a dealer. But I don't know how much he pushed Earhart herself. I mean, I think he did, but I think she also was a participant in that. Like it was helpful to her. She could be nice and humble and do all the things while he could be sort of the aggressive person making sure that she had all these speaking tours lined up and newspapers writing about her. She didn't have to do that then because she had him to do it. I don't know. Their marriage is super interesting. She wrote a letter to him on the morning of their wedding, which was a very, small in his mother's living room. She wrote this letter saying, let's give it a year. I'm really nervous about getting married because I don't want to be stuck staying at home. Maybe we'll meet other people and that's fine, but we'll just check in a year and see if we're going to stay married. And they did stay married. They stayed married until she disappeared.
How old was she when they married?
Let's see, that was 1933, I believe. Oh, no, it was 31. Yeah, 1931, right after her father died.
Okay, so 6 years before she becomes lost.
Right. They could have left each other in that time.
And this was a business. And one thing that I learned from your book that I hadn't read before is that really at the end of this, I mean, they had really put all their chips in on her making this round the world flight. Every bit of resource and financial means they had went towards her success, was dependent on her success to get across the Pacific. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Purdue University had purchased the plane. But the problem was when she made her first attempt to go around the world along the equator, she had ground looped when she was taking off from Hawaii, which means she didn't get enough lift, apparently, and the wings tilted over and they were smashed up. The engine was smashed up. So they had to pay for all the repairs. And it was just quite a logistical challenge to plan a flight around the world. You have to make sure that all the fuel is at all the stops. You have to make sure that all the permits are arranged, that you have the right shots, all these things. And they had to undo all that. And then they ended up having to go in a different direction because of the monsoon season. She had intended to fly west, but then she ended up having to fly east around the world. So there was a mechanic who was supposed to meet her in India and give the plane a whole once over, and he'd already flown out there, so they had to pay for his flight. It's just there were all these costs that built up. They had to decide whether she was going to make an attempt again and whether they could afford it. And they did a little bit more fundraising through Purdue, but they also mortgaged their house. And at some point she explained it saying, well, what are futures for without mortgaging them?
Right.
But his Putnam's granddaughter said that he was absolutely broke after she disappeared because the only way that the flights did not make money themselves. It was the speaking tours afterwards that made their money.
And the celebrity stuff afterwards.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Very interesting. So let's explain this flight. So she takes off. She heads eastward instead of westward. She's going around the equator. So basically the largest part of the world. She's going around the equator.
Mhm.
Her last leg. So she gets to Papua New Guinea, right?
Mhm.
Okay. And Papua New Guinea, she is supposed to fly to a place called Howland Island. And my word, Rachel, I looked at that. That is a pinprick in the middle of the ocean. Folks, go
It is.
figure this. You're like, wow, okay.
Yeah, it is so, so small. And yeah, it was very small. They were exhausted at that point because they were flying such long distances and having to get up before dawn to take off. And the island itself is interesting. I mean, if you take a step out, countries were kind of jockeying for influence in the Pacific. So Japan had all these islands under a mandate from the League of Nations. The U.S. had Guam, but also was trying to get a few more islands. And the U.S. had claimed Howland and a few of the islands nearby. So there were a couple of basically recent high school grads from Hawaii who were brought down just to live on Howland Island, just to say, yep, there are people living here. And it didn't have an airfield at all, or it didn't have any runways. So they had to ship people down to make these runways. The island was covered in birds. They had to use dynamite, which they weren't really supposed to do, to clear all the birds. It was barely 20 feet above sea level, so really hard to see. It was kind of a nightmare. And, in her first plan, that would have been her second leg. She would have flown from Hawaii to Howland, so when she was relatively fresh. But by going through the other direction, it was her second to last leg, or third to last leg, really. And, you can imagine how tiring it was.
Right, right. So I learned how to fly in Hawaii. I was
Oh,
stationed in
yes.
Hawaii. Yeah, so I
Uh-huh.
learned how to fly in Hawaii, and I've been on those atolls, and they are not tropical paradises. They really
No.
aren't. They're pretty.
No.
It's pretty rough going there. But is Howland Island? Is that part of what? Is that a part of an island chain? I know it's Micronesia, but is that part of like the
It's
Gardner
part
or
of the
the?
Line Islands.
Okay, the Line
Yeah.
Islands. Okay,
Right,
all right,
yeah. There's
all right.
Howland and Baker and Jarvis and maybe
Okay.
another one.
How about
Yeah.
Gardner? Is that one of them?
Gardner is part of the Phoenix Islands, so that's farther south.
Okay, so but that's a key island, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. So they were supposed to land. They had some Navy support. They had a ship, right? That was
Right.
staked outside of the island. They had two ships that they were actually relaying with and talking to. I know one was like the Itasca or the Itasca.
The Itasca was the one waiting at Howland, and
Okay,
then the Ontario was sort of halfway in between Papua New Guinea and Howland.
okay, and what these were going to do is they were going to kind of guide her in, but more importantly, they were going to be radio beacons for her and
Right.
navigational, right, and
Yeah.
communications. She doesn't make it. People they hear her voice for a while, right? They keep
Yeah.
hearing her, and she keeps asking, why. What does she say? I'm circling. I don't see the.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
What is
circling.
she? I must be on you, but I cannot see you.
Right. So they really don't know where she was at this point, right?
No, but they thought, her signal kept getting stronger. And at some point, let's see when she said, we are circling but cannot hear you, she sounded so loud and clear that one of the radio operators ran up on deck. He thought that he would be able to see her. But so she must have been, she was certainly had come close enough to be able to send a clear signal. Certainly improved from where she had been, say, in the middle of the night when they were just hearing static. But they also realized that she had never responded directly to their signals. It sounded like she couldn't hear them. They could hear her. But there were so many things that got mixed up. And part of it is, some of it was like a game of telephone. She's sending telegrams to the guy who's arranging it all, but it's getting mixed up in a way with the previous plans. They're on different time zones, and the Itasca is on a time zone that changes on the half hour, and they're on one that's changing on the hour, which doesn't happen anymore. And there were just different perceptions of how she would operate and how, a room full of radio operators would operate on a Coast Guard ship. They had their headphones on all the time. If they said they were going to talk, the person they were talking to would also have his headphones on the time, and they would be able to go back and forth. But she couldn't do that because she was juggling. She was flying the plane. She was managing the radio. She was communicating not just with the Itasca, but with other ships. So she had set up a schedule that she could follow so she could manage all the things that she was supposed to be doing. And there's a schedule. This is her schedule, and you can see why it would have been confusing. So 10 minutes after the hour, she would be listening for the Ontario when she was getting close to the halfway mark. 15 minutes after the hour, she'd be transmitting to the Itasca just to tell them where she was. Then 18 minutes after the hour, she'd transmit to Ley. that's in New Guinea. 20 minutes, she'd listen to hear what they said in Leh, with weather, they were updating with weather reports. 30 minutes, she'd listen for the Itasca, and then 45 minutes after the hour, she'd message the Itasca. If you get those messed up, she's speaking when she's supposed to be listening,
Right.
or
Okay.
listening when she expects people. So it got really messed up. So I think that's part of it. The plane was so heavy when it was taking off that, in Leh, the runway ended in sort of a bluff over the bay, and the plane took off, but it almost sunk
Wow.
below eye level and
Mm.
splashed the water when it took off. And, some witnesses said it looked like a radio antenna that had a trailing antenna, and that got damaged. So there was that. And the direction finder, it was new at that point.
Okay. It
She,
was, yeah. Okay. So it was a new
yeah.
piece of equipment,
And she
right?
had never used it, and she hadn't used it in her flight across the Atlantic. She hadn't used it, a direction finder, in her flight from Hawaii to California. So she was used to making these big flights without it. So when it didn't work, she was just like, oh, it doesn't work. And it's not like she had a manual to look
Sure.
at.
But she had Fred Noonan on board, and Fred
Right,
Noonan, he was doing celestial navigation, right?
right.
He was shooting the stars or shooting sun, which that's not easy to do in any circumstance. So
Yeah.
really interesting. So she goes down, and there are three theories, and I want you to talk about your trip to the island of Nikumaroro. Is that the one you went to? Oh, yes.
Nikumaroro. Yeah.
Okay. Because you actually went there. What was that like? Tell us about that trip and what you guys were looking for.
Sure. So this was the trip I talked about earlier. It was a trip that was organized by some members of this organization called TIGAR, or the International Group for, I always get this number, the International Group for the Recovery of Historic Aircraft, something like that. And they've been to this island many times, and their theory is that when Earhart and Noonan did not find Howland Island, they flew south because they knew the Phoenix Islands were to the south. And they landed on Nikumaroro, which is a coral atoll. And if the tide was low, they would have been able to land on the relatively flat coral reef around the island. It probably would have busted up their landing gear because it's actually not flat. But it was their best option. So that's their theory. They've been there probably more than 10 times. They have not found the plane. They found other suggestive things, including burn features, which are, archaeological speak for signs of a campfire, including jars put in the campfire, presumably to boil water. They found clamshells that indicate somebody had broken the shells open kind of clumsily to get the meat inside. They found 1930s era things like a zipper pull, cosmetic case,
Ah,
a pocket
wow.
knife.
Okay.
But none of these things have been tied directly to Earhart. The other very interesting thing is that after Earhart disappeared, just coincidentally not related to Earhart, the British colonized that island. It's to grow coconuts, and they moved a bunch of people from what is now Kiribati, which was getting overcrowded, they said, and they brought them over to work on these coconut, not really fields, but coconut plants. And some of them found some bones at this site, and like 13 bones. The bones were shipped off to Fiji, where the colonial office was, and they were examined by a doctor there who wasn't a forensic doctor, who said it was probably, somebody, a local man of some, a Micronesian
Okay.
man. And then the bones have been lost. Nobody knows what happens to those 13 bones. But there are many, many more bones in the human body than just 13. So the rest of the bones must be somewhere. Tiger hasn't found them anywhere, but they had the bright idea of bringing human remains detection dogs. And these are dogs that have been used a lot, this group especially in California, to identify Native American burial sites. And dogs have been able to detect burials from thousands of years ago. So they brought these dogs, these 4 very cute border collies, to the site where they found the burn site. And the dogs sniffed around and they all alerted, which means they all said, yes, we smell human remains. But the complicating thing is there are also these coconut crabs, these very large dinner plate sized crabs, and also lots of little hermit crabs. Those crabs will eat carrion, basically. And they sometimes apparently drag what they're eating into their burrows. So the thought was, and this is kind of morbid, is that the person who died, who possibly could be Amelia Earhart, the crabs ate him or her and dragged some of the bones into their burrows.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
Wow. Okay.
I know.
Wow.
Like, it's wild. So, and it was very exciting. You know, everybody got so excited when the dogs, sat and looked expectantly at their trainers. But then we all started looking. Well, I watched and talked to people, but everybody was going through the soil at this site. The trouble is that it's a coral atoll, so everything is based on coral. That's basically what the soil is. And coral and bones look a lot alike.
Yeah, I bet.
And there were experts there. There were several archaeologists, osteologists. People kept saying, is this a bone? And they would look at it and nope, not a bone. It was just coral after coral after coral. So no bones were found on this expedition. So what they ended up deciding to do, and this was the idea of Fred Hebert, who was the National Geographic archaeologist in resident at the time. He had seen some research that people had been able to take soil out of cave in Europe and identify DNA. Actually, no, I think it was mitochondrial RNA from Neanderthal people in the soil. So I think the thinking was, well, that Neanderthal, long time ago, 1930s, not so long ago. Maybe we can collect some soil where the dogs alerted and see if we can identify any DNA. But unfortunately, the tests on that were not. I think what happened is they found sort of there was something, but it was just too
tenuous,
damaged. Yeah,
too
to
tenuous.
identify.
And then there's stories that they were caught by the Japanese in Saipan, and that one doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't, but it seems to like rear its head every now and then, doesn't it?
Yeah. People really like that one. Yeah, the theory, that one has a lot of branches, that theory, but the idea is that somehow they got really off course and ended up either in Saipan or the Marshall Islands. And there are people who say they saw her on Saipan or they saw a white woman on Saipan. And the main woman who sort of sparked all this theory was this woman named Josephine Blanco, who grew up on Saipan. And when she was around 11, she was bringing lunch to her brother-in-law, who worked at a harbor or a seaplane base that the Japanese had built on Saipan. And when she brought her lunch to her brother-in-law, there were 2 white pilots at the harbor. And she didn't realize that one of the white pilots was a woman because she'd never seen a woman with short hair wearing pants before. But then she heard later on that the 2 people were killed. But there's lots of different versions of this story, with her dying in lots of different ways. She and Noonan were executed. He died from a head wound, and she was later executed. They died of dysentery. They actually ended up in the Marshall Islands instead, and then were brought to Saipan. Even she was brought to Hirohito's palace in Japan and was used to prevent the U.S. from killing him during World War II, and then somehow she was involved in planning Pearl Harbor, which no,
That one
she probably
somehow
didn't.
that one somehow Yeti's involved in that one too. I don't know, that
Right.
one is that
Yeah,
one's a little far-fetched. I don't
it
know.
is. It really comes out of just what was going on at the time, though, because in
Right.
the 30s, Japan had the South Seas Mandate, so all these more than 1,000 islands, and they didn't let a lot of foreigners in. So people didn't know what was going on, but they knew that Japan was already acting aggressively towards China. It had taken Manchuria, and it actually, I think 5 days after Earhart disappeared, there basically a war started between Japan and China. So people just didn't know what was going on there. So of course rumors were rife. And then Pearl Harbor happens, and then there's all these, troops going from island to island fighting the Japanese. And, there's a bunch of people who, because they were fighting the Japanese and it was terrible fights, they had paranoid views of what the Japanese, or maybe even not paranoid at the time, but
Right.
their views of the Japanese they were not nuanced, I would
Right.
say.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
some people said one guy said he found her 10-year diary and a suitcase full of women's effects and gave it to his commanding officer, but nobody ever has seen it since. Pictures, photos, a photo album that another Marine gave to his commanding officer, never to be seen again. So I don't know. I just think it was also just an atmosphere where rumors were probably
Part of the
flying.
right.
Yeah, fog of war kind of situation.
Now, the craziest one is with Irene. What was it? Irene Bolam.
Bolam. Yeah.
I think that she made it back to
Yeah.
the States, and because she does look a little bit like an older Amelia Earhart, but that one, ooh, that one's a little far out there.
Yeah, it is really far because this she had a well-documented life. She worked in business.
This was Irene
Um,
Bolam. Yeah, I mean, she
Irene
was.
Bolam did.
Yeah, she was a
Yeah,
normal person. She was married. She was, yeah. I mean, that one is crazy. The one that seems this Elgin Long, is that his name?
yeah, yeah.
That one seems the most plausible, where he was a navigator himself
Hmm.
and really looking at it, and that she probably took a drink in the ocean. And
Yeah.
I don't know. What are your thoughts? What do you think happened to old Amelia?
Well, I mean, I don't know, and nobody knows, even if they say they do. But I think just going by Occam's razor and opting for the one where I have to make the fewest leaps of faith or suspend my disbelief the least, I think she probably ran out of gas and ended up in the ocean. When I first went out to Nikumaroro, I was really impressed by all the things they'd found, but I still have there's still some big gaps in that. Like why wouldn't she have radioed that she was flying south and looking for the Phoenix Islands? So I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think we do have the technology if somebody's willing to spend the money and go out there and, basically go back and forth across large swaths of the Pacific seabed. We have the technology to find things now. And I did go out on a second expedition with Bob Ballard, who found the Titanic, and he was looking for the plane around Nikumaroro. He's obviously very good at finding things, and he had state of the art equipment. No plane was found right around the island.
Huh. I think it'll eventually be found. I
Hmm.
had a guy named Jim Bellingham on an earlier show who is with MIT and does the deep sea robotics. He was telling me that only like 1 to 2% of the whole ocean is actually mapped. And
Yeah.
yeah, and I can't imagine the Pacific is a well mapped ocean,
Mm-mm, no.
especially that part of the world. So who knows? Maybe one day she'll be found. What does this say about us? Do you think, Rachel, that we have just had this fascination with this woman and her disappearance for so long?
Yeah. I mean, It says a lot of things and kind of depends on what people focus on. In terms of our fascination with her, she just strikes me as somebody who would seem modern to us now, even if she was plopped down in 2026, she would just be so curious about everything that was going on and up to date. She probably could use AI better than I can. She just was a very curious, eyes wide open kind of person. And
Right.
I think that is really attractive. And she also figured out how to do things that women are still struggling to figure out how to do. And I don't mean flying. I mean, obviously, women can fly. You know how to fly. I mean, just deciding to do something and not letting anything stop you from doing it. And not in a aggressive, forceful way, just in a why shouldn't I do it? Just a very practical, like, well, of course I can do it. If I want to do it, I'm going to try to do it.
Yeah.
Just
Wow. She was really grab the bulls by the horn or, grab the bull by the horn
right. Yeah.
type girl. And I do. I'm with you. I have a lot of admiration for her, someone that was willing to go against the grain to say, hey,
Hmm.
you know what? And her curiosity was actually, I think, her main driver of,
Yeah.
hey, can we do this? Can I do this? Can I challenge myself? I I really do. I have a lot of admiration for her. I have a lot of gratitude for her because I was an Army pilot, and she was one of
Yeah.
the pioneers for aviation for women, and of course, my granddaughter's name Amelia.
Oh,
So,
really?
yes.
Yeah.
So,
Good.
I well, you know what? I wanna congratulate you on this book. It's actually, folks, it's a quick read, but it's really interesting. Whatever you've read about Amelia Earhart, whatever you think you know about Amelia Earhart, read this book because Rachel really brings out some new details, and especially you have to read about, kind of the the crazy theories, the serious theories, the work that has been done to find Amelia Earhart and to solve one of, the 20th century's great mystery. Rachel, when is the book due out? It's due out March 3rd, correct?
Yeah, March 3rd.
Okay, and you have a website?
I do. It's rachelhartiganauthor.com.
Okay, great. Any projects up in the future? Any more adventurers out there?
Well, I may be starting a monthly column with National Geographic on other lost explorers. So
Oh, do
I have
it.
to
Oh,
I have to figure out which ones to write about, but I think
that'd be
that'll be
good.
fun.
You know what? We'll definitely have you back on, okay? If
Great,
that's
that
all
would be
right with you.
fun.
Okay, great. Rachel, I really wanna thank you and thank you for your time to talk to us today.
Thanks, it's been fun.
Okay, fly safe.